everyone. So for today's panel, we have Farsam Shadab, founder of Anaxion Interactive and the Bay Area's first integral commons. Thank you for being with us, Farsam.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you. And we also have Tyler Thurmond. Tyler is a serial entrepreneur and business operator with 15 years of emerging technology experience across the applied science, IoT, renewables, and fintech sectors. Thank you for being with us, Tyler.
Pleasure.
Great. Is Robert here? I'm not sure that Robert is
He
here.
is not.
Nope.
Due to scheduling conflict, I notified Carl, and it's just going to be Tyler Thurmond and myself.
All right, perfect. And your moderator today is Carl Seelig. Carl is co-founder of ChainBLX.io and curator of Digital Davos. Over to you, Carl.
Very much. Thank you very much, everyone. This time, Tyler and Farsam, we decided to make this more a roundtable discussion, as the third panelist is missing, and I would like to invite first Farsam and then Tyler to introduce.
Sorry, Carl, it sounds like you're a little bit far away. Is there any way you could speak?
Okay, I have to go closer. Do you hear me now better?
Much better.
Yes.
Yes, much better. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. I repeat. Thank you very much for Farsam, Tyler, to be here. And as the third panelist is missing, we make this more a roundtable discussion.
Fantastic.
So this is more comfortable for three people. So I would like to invite first Farsam a little bit to speak about himself, and then Tyler, and we kick up from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl, and thank you for having us. This is a fantastic time, and the prior conversation actually set a really great framework for some of the matters that we're going to be addressing here today. This is a very critical year, as we all know, and everyone is looking to new solutions. Those of us who've been vested in the blockchain communities for quite some time now are more than poised. And some of the topics we're going to address today are going to look at what some of the long-standing, let's say, legacy issues keeping blockchain from the permutations of development necessary to get the global reach and penetration that we've been hoping for over a decade would have perhaps already had been the case had we looked out from 2010 to 2020. A lot of people would have already projected much more penetration. At the same time, we want to keep this a very accessible and grounded conversation because there's a fair amount of, you could call it meta theory around mathematics and the underlying logics. But my own background is coming out of a variety of different disciplines. My overall training is interdisciplinary. I started off in cognitive science, which also informed our studies with a really great computer science foundation, and I have worked in and around Silicon Valley for over 2 decades now across various startups. My first artificial intelligence startup that I was at was back in the year 2000, actually. And ever since then, I've had an eye to new developing technology futures, technological trends, but also the reasonable and rational convergence of these things as social and cultural phenomenon. So I can go as far out to the stars as anyone else in terms of science fiction visionary thinking, but more and more every day now, I'm really rooted in how are we going to change the global landscape this decade, and specifically the next 5-year window is very critical. Our talk today is going to be on really ultimately a post-cartesian perspective on blockchain, and that can perhaps be a bit much, but I will unpack that for you, and I'll pause here and allow my colleague Tyler Thurmond to introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Carl, for having us, and Davos Digital. What a pleasure. It's an honor to be sitting here with Farsam and you guys here today. As Farsam said, we're definitely we're always coming around the curve, right? It's a continuous transition as the different drivers in the world tend to slowly but surely make the inevitable happen. And so, as Farsam is stating, today we're going to talk about a rather obscure kind of field of mathematics and holonomics, to that basically will inform a new evolution in technology and variety of solutions that hopefully will bring about a happier and better future for everyone. So I look forward to diving into that today. I mostly focus on solutions that have to do with governance, that leverage artificial intelligence and machine learning. Very active right now in the COVID-19 fight by using smart technology systems. Like, for example, this, which is a new project we're doing with Atos. Pretty cool thing. Smart terminals, smart hand sanitizers, things like that. And so just happy to be here today and participate in this conversation. Hopefully we can evolve the understanding of how we see where we're going.
Thank you very much. And Fassam was promising us today in prior conversations which you had a really deep dive. So I don't want to stay there in the way. You mentioned a word which I just don't want even to repeat for some. So emphasize, please, what does it mean and how does it function?
Yes, specifically this conversation of augmented cognition.
Yes. What do you understand with augmented cognition?
Right. So the AR space right now, I see it as this strange attractor that's bringing a kind of invisible organizing principle to a bit of chaos that the first 2 to 3 decades of the internet culture has brought into being. We talk about this as excessive disintermediation. You know, we had a giant internet boom and bubble from the 90s coming into the aughts, and that bubble burst, and we saw a shift, a kind of epochal phase transition. And what we birthed in that Web 2.0 scenario was the full advent of social media. We saw pockets of it into the late 90s, but really the emergence of Facebook and the titans of social media as we treat them and see them now have brought the mobile web full forward into how we look at what we define as our internet experience. The role of the individual's cognition, cognitive capacities, and how we orient is a human factors conversation. Human factors basically is the deep organizing system that is used to study and design effectively user interface. But user interface is often treated mistakenly as a thin layer, a thin, shallow 2D consideration of where do I place things, what's the optimal time and decision making, what is the cognitive load that an average person can handle, what is the workflow that necessitates optimal or workplace productivity, et cetera. When you start looking into the deeper matters of cognition and the deeper social consequences of effectively 30 years now of public internet, we have a number of challenges before us. Whether or not we buy in completely to the thesis presented to us in The Social Dilemma, which I think is a fantastic orientation or reframework, redesign modus operandi that they're driving, which was not easy for them to do. I very much sign off on most of what's presented by the Center for Humane Technology and Tristan Harris behind The Social Dilemma. But at the same time, I feel like there's a few missed points. We're going to address those missed points in our presentation today regarding how blockchain and the world of augmented everything, which includes augmented cognition, are really neck and neck right now. And they're entering into the mainstream, and they will be here as part of how we define culture, society, personal and global evolution, but as well as civilization. Now, to take those broad abstract concepts and to make them conversationally vivid right now and make them real, I'm going to talk about the very simple tool set that Apple is leading with. That's the framework we need to look at in terms of understanding what to anticipate, not just over the forthcoming decade, but over the next 2 years principally. There's conversation and debate about this, but in some schools, consideration around this, the Apple Glass was going to already be in existence right now. Apple had various tactical reasons to hold off. It's our contention that they're going to drive like they have with Apple Watch and other wearable prospects that have hung off of it, tethered to the iPhone, first version of Apple Glass, and in about 1 year's time. There's some consideration that it might even be as early as this coming Christmas season. The whole COVID scenario and pandemic scenario has possibly put extended pressure on them to be able to release these things earlier and sooner. Right now, with both the pressure to develop technology in a forward moving direction, but also take into consideration and take stock of just whether or not the rapid deployment and development of these things globally over this 3-decade window has run roughshod over too many people, and too many consequences are now coming to the fore. Without taking a political position, we look at what's happening right now in the US presidential transition, which is going to be over the next 24 hours, as possibly having been, or most likely having been, highly influenced by a very chaotic system. And with convergence of technologies, we have the possible divergence of human societal realities. What we want to do is to be able to bring that into balance and to check, so that the ongoing convergence of technologies, which are going to happen in a sort of inevitable fashion over the coming decades, specifically the development and maturation of the virtual reality and extended reality spaces into a unified augmented reality platform, and in parallel, the BCI space, the brain-computer interaction. Again, these are two branches of the human factors design space that have now matured to a point where they are basically ready for public consumption, and market spaces are being developed for them. Also, the 12-month immersion for most of us that we've had to deal with at working from home and discovering that virtuality and working in distributed office spaces is actually far more viable of a prospect when enough people sign on. So the long tail of that is kind of being experienced right now. But once we're able to solve for intermediation, coming out of the disintermediation problems we have now, again, too many mobile devices, too much information flow being the main considerations around the cognitive pressures. The cultural parlance right now is, my teenager is distracted, or my partner only spends 5 minutes talking to me in bed, but they spend an hour on their phone right before they go to bed. These are kind of folk ways of talking about what all of us take for granted and know is the case, that the power and potency of our mobile web devices and what drives them has not necessarily been taken into full consideration. And if not,
you do a really good point, for example. And you speak about the perceptive filter with cognitive overload, of course, which most teens experience, also my 14 years old daughters. Could you, one question was coming up during your presentation right now, always in mind. Could you emphasize also from the augmented cognition, the cognition part, that cognition and affection and behavior all form an attitude. Can you emphasize also a little bit in this direction?
Absolutely. So specifically an attitude of cognition and emotion and how. So I don't want to, because of our limits on time, talk about too many studies and things, but there's a broad consensus at this time that basically attention span and emotional resonance or empathy are both being shallowed. In fact, there are numbers, something like the average human attention span is down below 5 seconds. And that basically we see this with clickbait, advertising, refresh rates, and jump cuts in just about all forms of media, that if you ask someone's general attention to have to pay attention to something for more than 3 seconds, you better make it interesting. They're going to have to pay attention to only that and tune out of the things around them. This is all part of the challenge around building and designing around what we mean by Web 3.0. And that's the ultimate framing for what we're talking about here, Carl, because the challenge of the decade ahead has a back-end design as far as disintermediation, distributed ledgers, and the trust that needs to be built in systems so that Web 3.0 is a web of IoT and everything that hangs off of that. A lot of people like to vertically stack and say AR, VR, IoT, and blockchain. But in fact, these things actually I see as more of an expression of the IoT space, and blockchain is the lingua franca, the actual intercontextual linguistic systems at the software layer that make it all function and operate. And until we can develop the right systems that can handle that, we're not going to be able to make the transition. And so I actually paint in some of my work a sort of disaster scenario of 2025 and 2030, where blockchain has not been able to make the evolutionary leaps necessary to keep it all coherent. So Web 2.0 was the evolution into the mobile web, and Web 3.0 necessarily needs to be a distributed trust-based system where, to work with a fun example, I have my smartwatch, I'm driving down the street, I get a signal, somebody's dog is suffering and about to die in their home, and I'm on a trusted network, and I walk up to their front door because nobody's home, and their system trusts me enough to open their door, let me in, and bring that animal attention. That animal has a smart collar. That smart collar has been tracking their biorhythms and knows that something is highly wrong and in crisis. So that's a kind of family friendly example. But right now, today, if a couple of startups tried to make that happen in today's environment, it's not going to go anywhere. I mean, we know that Amazon, apologies, with the Ring system that they acquired, still has struggles just getting their already very built out delivery system validated under these measures. So I hope that answered that with also a little more context.
Marshall, if I could add a kind of I think a simpler analysis of this definitely this paradox we find ourselves in, is I think we've just as a species have been doing the Silicon Valley move of failing fast. I mean, it's been a great 30 years plus for the internet thus far. Obviously, we didn't use it optimally, hindsight 2020. And like you said, it resulted in more of a vertical looking thing, a siloization of platform effect, as opposed to universal tools, right? And that has kind of created the phenomenon that we see today and all the issues with data, privacy, and things like that. But the transition, like you're saying, Farsam, is certainly inevitable. Obviously, as you pointed on in the end of your statement right there, is rollout and network partnerships are going to be key to making that happen. And I think, unfortunately, in the process, like we normally do, we tend to see the best and the worst of things happen at the same time. So we can imagine, based upon today, as you were saying, Carl, with your 14-year-old, children today, they're interested in being professional YouTube stars. So imagine what the AR version of that is. And perhaps it's one where you can't log off. And of course, there is no editing because it's not required. So it could be very, very interesting indeed. So we need to embrace it. It's going to be great.
Thank you. Interesting. So when you speak about blockchain as the glue which holds the IoT and everything together, and we know all that the blockchain has to evolve because the trust network is a little bit too slow. What did you see for good developments or promising developments that you think we will have a blockchain which can handle all this data in the future?
That's a perfect transition to the main thesis of our presentation on what we mean by post-cartesian perspective on blockchain. What does that even reference? There has been, coming out of the world of systems theory and physics since the 1970s, broadly construed nonlinear mathematics, very also influenced by quantum physics breakthroughs that necessitated new forms of calculus and new forms of computation in order to even make sense of so much parallel in physics terms phenomenology, so much happening at once. I think the parallel is appropriate, totally spot on for what's happening in the blockchain space. I mean, some people cringe at all the crypto startups, but I actually, except for the ones that are, scams, I really appreciate this Cambrian explosion because we need that level of creativity and iteration to happen now and continue to happen for some time because there's many facets to this. Tyler and I came together as colleagues approximately a decade ago as well in the study of a body of nonlinear mathematics known as vortex-based mathematics. VBM for short actually has the potential to scale far more infinitely than conventionally construed mathematics. And that scalability also solves problems in other areas. So it addresses the augmented cognition challenge, which is what does it mean to actually have uh, uh, ubiquitous computing in the full sense? Howard Rheingold popularized that idea in his 1990 book from the late 1990s. But he just couldn't get to the point of envisioning what we're doing right now. So ubiquitous computing, however, is not always a good thing unless we have done the human factors considerations around, well, what is the right time of day to be hit with a ton of information for me as an individual? Is it 8 a.m. or is it 8 p.m.? I don't know. What is the proper recovery time? What is my optimal cognitive function? Is it having 5 emails open and trying to answer all these questions at once? Or is it doing one really good deep dive focus session? We're not going to be nagged. It's not, we're not suggesting that AI chatbots are going to track us all day and surveil us and guide us and say, you should do this and you should not do that. It's going to be much more of an intuitive thing where we have the right human factors tools. Now, again, without digressing, there is a entire branch of this which involves neurotech, and neurotech has its own tracking kind of branch, sub branch. What we're talking about these days right now is just the core concepts of what it means to be in what's termed professionally, believe it or not, as cognitive flow. Flow states are when we are processing information without being super self-conscious about it. We're actually achieving a kind of technologically facilitated, ideally, ability to handle a lot of information and move through stuff without getting ground up in the gears of all the processing. Right now, our contention also from a design point of view, and that's something that maybe could be unpacked in a future conversation, is the way in which you use UX, user interface design, and user experience has inherited so much legacy design and engineering assumptions from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s that we need to completely from the ground up redesign that space. That redesign challenge is an augmented reality immersion challenge because AR, and this is where there's a feedback loop and a feed forward loop happening at the same time. As Apple drives forward AR, so they like they've done with the Apple Watch, they popularize the thing, and then everyone else has to catch up, including Samsung, who's pacing them. And then the blockchain world is going to have a fantastic new, highly probable opportunity space to operate within, where they have real world use case examples of needing to deliver a distributed ledger that can, like in the example of being able to be permitted into a complete stranger's house, not be breaking any laws, also not be taking on new liabilities myself, but actually just doing something that we used to take for granted 100 years ago, which is you trust your entire village, you trust your entire community, you trust your entire neighborhood unconditionally. But we can't do that in today's world. So how can we return to that?
You spoke before about the cognitive flow. And of course, we know that Kahneman got the Nobel Prize for his studies on basically, it was on the financial influence, but it had to do on his basic studies of cognitive flow. And there was also then a lot of studies from Jacobi et al., which were about online processing of information and the order of information with the influence of them in the perception in. How do you see that the processing and the timing of information as the blockchain will have all the information, of course, ledger, as we get all the information exposed at the same time? How does this concept apply to what you're doing?
Right. What I'm doing is two things. One, as we have our enterprise pursuits, we have a consortium and an incubator. But what I also do is study the entire field and try to make accurate prognostications. Um, Cognitive load is a wonderful academic abstraction. It covers a lot of ground, and it's kind of neutral because it's not saying anything good or bad. It's just trying to quantify perhaps um, alongside the examples I made earlier about working memory and attention span. Cognitive load is also at an all-time high. And there's a related branch of adult developmental psychology pioneered by Robert Keegan. And his book, The Mental Demands of Modern Life, is so fantastic. Mental demands really just makes the case for um, in order to just feel like a normal part of society, normal part of the fabric, now we have the hyper acceleration of cultural expectations. I mean, honestly, to be a little cheeky, I would say there are grandmothers who do more when they're IT savvy, information technology skilled, than someone in their 30s was doing back in the 1960s. I mean, that's just how much technology has moved things. But at the same time, the cognitive burden, you can talk about cognitive load, but then there's a burden over time, there's a cost. And until these things become far more humanely designed in the human factors conversation, we're going to actually see a decade from now a new kind of burnout, a new kind of cognitive stress, and a new kind of overwhelm in terms of what there may even be psychological and psychiatric labels for.
I see Thelma up there, and this means normally that we run out of time. So I would like to know if we are running out of time, that we can also tailor some opportunity to speak, or do we have still time, Thelma?
So we are waiting on, it looks like 2 more people. We're waiting on Aaron and Nicholas, it looks like.
Okay, so we have
So-
no time. Thank you.
Yeah.
Fasan, Tyler, please go ahead. Sorry.
Tyler, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I think that you hit it right on the head. I think that it is inevitable that we also develop a artificial general intelligence that is aware of our tendencies to miss the bar in execution and just the human experience. And I think the interesting thing is that, again, going back to this mathematics that Farsam's been discussing, which we've had a dive with you, Carl, is that there is I would implore people to look into or kind of explore mentally the idea of a 6-axis curvilinear nested matrice that would be capable of symmetrical and asymmetrical fractalization, that would encompass its own prime number sieve kind of Hopfield neural network, again, as a basis for this AGI. And something like that, I feel is inevitable, and not just me, but many other people. And I know Farsam has seen a lot of this stuff happen behind the scenes as well. But it will be an AI that will be actually quite complementary to the human cognition experience. And so there's going to be a lot of hiccups, obviously, as we get there. But the one-to-one mathematics do exist. And I think that's the big thing that's coming. So it's definitely a pursuit worth fighting for. Farsam, would you like to add anything to that?
You mentioned something really important, and because of the limited time probably left, I want to make sure to reference Robert Grant's Crown Sterling approach to data encryption, which also is a major innovation prospect for what's happening in blockchain as a whole. And there is a wonderful overview of that at crownsterling.io. And the importance of that is because of their approach to mathematics being in this category of post-cartesian, nonlinear, and following principles of EBM, but what they actually did was apply something known as prime factorization. And that is really changing the base logic of the math. So not just the binary logic systems, but the bases. And so not only does it create encryptability that goes orders of magnitude beyond what today's encryption systems standards are, it might be the beginning of a new movement. And also Holochain, which I'm a big advocate of with their approaches because they're rooted in peer-to-peer. So our overall model, is available in a white paper that'll be published in about 4 weeks time. If anyone wants to take note of a URL, it's holopedia.com.
URL so that we can distribute it through the audience from Digital Davos. This would be really helpful. I think there's a lot of interest.
Yes, holopedia.com is where it'll be published. Just like it sounds, HOLOpedia.com.
Thank you so much.
Okay.